The pace of our breathing, the rising and falling of the score regulated by a nearly inaudible rhythm. We knew each song, word for word, and could anticipate every line. The movements of the characters were memorized by our limbs, and our small bodies mimicked them as they played out on the screen. Like swaying flowers, the wind of the moving images nudging us in unison. The duration of the film was a place, and the escape into Dorothy's body a sure evasion. I lay there on the dirty floor of the apartment, waking up in a closet-sized bedroom. My line of sight framed by piles of dirty laundry, trays of cigarette butts, abandoned soda cups. The night before, from what I could remember, Mike got into it with several other people, all of them drunk on $2.40s, yelling and threatening each other. This was usually the case with this group, every social gathering spilling over with unchecked testosterone. That night we all got together because Mike said he found these crazy videos, footage from Hiroshima, and he wanted to watch them with the sound off while we listened to some death metal band. The other guys encouraged it, and it never really mattered if I was into it or not. Truth is, even if we didn't want to, everyone just kind of went along with him, you know? Mike was a tweaker, shifty, violent, but the only one with an apartment where we could drink, so we all put up with his bullshit. At some point in the middle of an argument, he waved a small pistol around like some deranged cop spouting off about how it was his house and he would make the rules. The blaring music swallowed any chance of reconciliation. I wasn't really concerned with any of it, but instead drifted out of sight with my beer and a pocket full of pills I stole from my mother. I read somewhere that aspirin and alcohol, enough of it anyway, could cause some kind of damage to your liver and kidneys. So that afternoon, before the guys picked me up, I emptied the contents of every bottle of painkillers in our medicine cabinet into the pockets of my Levi's. In my mind, it was a deliberate, practical plan, same as if I set out to fix a broken window or make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Calculating how and when and where I would die was just a series of decisions, absent of any typical picture of suicide, you know. No frantic phone call, no crying, no poetic monologues. Probably because the why was already so resolved to me. I had visualized it thousands of times, and I was able to justify all of my reasons. The physical motions just sort of sat in my mind like a to-do list. I'd lay in bed at night, you know, imagining what it would feel like to drift away. And always it was this kind of falling sensation, like a fading light, a feather nearing the earth and then rest. The anticipated relief in the fantasy was enough, until it wasn't. And for whatever reason, that day struck me as the perfect day to do it. And collecting the pills worked into the routine of getting ready to go out. I didn't swallow all the pills at once, but instead took a few at a time while I sat there on the couch observing everyone watching these videos. The screen of the television occupied by this woman's silent face. She'd stand there, posed like a mugshot, and turn forward slowly so the camera guy could get all the details, the skin on her pretty face smeared like wet clay, disintegrated ears. Sometimes he'd get a shot of her hands, fingers that had been stitched together by the heat of the bomb, palms up, then turned over to see the melted knuckles. Repeat, back up to the face, and her eyes locked in on mine. As I stared, I really began to feel like they were looking back at me. She knew. The guys sort of half-watched the videos. Mostly, their reactions came in the form of laughter and enthusiastic woes and damns, really impressed by the historic gore. They didn't know her like I did. Quiet and invisible, I would take a big gulp of my beer, swallow a few pills, and take another drink. No one noticed what I was doing, and I enjoyed my private, violent act, the way it was gently woven into the night without any kind of spectacle. It made me feel powerful, secretive, and in hindsight, that was probably the first time in a long time that I felt like I was in charge of my body, so much so that I possessed the authority to kill it. I watched everyone in the room, viewing the scene from above, already like a ghost. And I wondered if they knew that I knew they were all so transparent. This group of friends was composed of the neighborhood's burnouts, myself included, and we all clung to each other, grasping for stone life rafts, playing out our psychodramas through complicated teenage rage, punk rock, heavy metal. Each of us suffered a loss, an absent parent, abuse, poverty, the general sense that we didn't belong where we were, in our bodies, in this school, this town. I mean, every teenager goes through this to some degree, even under the best circumstances. Adolescence is usually the site where you start to realize just how fucked up the world really is, and if you're lucky, you make it out relatively unscathed, and you can reduce that period of your life to a quick and naive narrative, laughing off all the ways you took things so seriously when you compare it to your so-called real adult life. But for some of us, real life started this early, and the comfort of naivete was a luxury that sat just out of reach. I had already seen so much. You know, there's this part in The Wizard of Oz when Dorothy comes back from meeting Professor Marvel, and she rushes home to beat the tornado, but gets to the farmhouse after everyone's already gone down into the basement. And she wanders through the empty house, opening doors, calling for Aunt Em, Uncle Henry. And as she walks into her bedroom, a gust of wind rips the window right off its hinges, and the thing goes flying into the air and hits her in the head. And the blow knocks her unconscious. A close-up of her face shows several layers of nearly still images shifting, guiding us alongside her into this, in-between space. And when she opens her eyes, we all gaze out the open window, as it frames the orbiting cows, a rowboat, chicken coop, an old woman knitting. Miss Gulch flies by on her bicycle, swept up by the turning wind, and quickly transforms into the witch on her broomstick. Dorothy and Toto look out the window onto the screen, puzzled, and then she realizes that the house is beginning to fall. She hangs onto the bed, and it slides around the room, and finally they land. She lets out this gasp, and this perfect sliver of silence cuts right into the film. The wind has stopped, and they're on the ground. And she gets up slowly, leaves the room, and opens the front door of the house. And we're right behind her as she peers in through the opening. That slow pull of the door, like a curtain, reveals the technicolor. Anyway, while I was sitting there, little by little finishing off the pills, I listened to the gaggle of dudes rattle on about their guitar solos and stared blankly at the television. The music set on repeat bellowed while the people in these videos stood there naked, their eyes empty, looking back at me, and all I could think about was the scene in The Wizard of Oz. But not so much about the scene itself. What I was really thinking about was poor Dorothy after the movie ends. How would she ever be able to tell anyone what that was like, opening that door? You know, sure, she could tell everyone about Oz, all the characters she met, the flying monkeys, the poppies, the horse of a different color, all that shit was really sort of tangible, even if it was strange. I mean, you could tell people how everything looked, what it smelled like, what it felt like. But that moment, opening the door, and really the milliseconds before you see color, that had to be the hardest thing to remember. Definitely the hardest thing to explain to anyone. I got down to the last 10 pills and quietly disappeared into the other room. The muffled noise of a drunken Metallica sing-along pushed against the closed door. There was a full-length mirror leaning on the wall. The crappy table lamp in the corner of the room cast harsh yellow light on one side of my body, and I stood there for a few minutes looking at my reflection. The surface of the mirror was fogged with dust. The bed beside me covered with clothes, trash, the room laced with the smell of cigarette ash. I swallowed the last of the pills with the tail end of my warm beer and remembered my sisters and I sitting on the floor of our old house watching The Wizard of Oz. And my belly ached. My eyes were heavy. Slipping onto the floor, lying on my back, I started to drift. Beneath me was a watery support. And as I closed my eyes, I didn't feel anything like regret or sadness or anything except that I wouldn't be able to tell anyone what this sensation was like. I wasn't watching this with anyone. Everyone knows the end of the movie. You know, Dorothy's laying there with a towel on her head. Everyone's gathered around as she wakes up from her dream. Through the open window, Professor Marvel peers in to check on her, and everyone has a good laugh while she tries to explain where she's been, that they were all there too. The scene is set again in sepia, and Dorothy sort of squints her eyes, shakes her head, and she believes what Aunt Em says about dreaming silly things. But you know, I never did quite buy it. Because the thing about opening a door like that is that it isn't a dream. It is a place, and it never really closes.